The Jaltor Dominion had crushed 47 star systems in their march across the galaxy. Their method was simple and it worked every time. They arrived with overwhelming force, demanded total surrender, and destroyed anyone who refused. Commander Vector stood on the bridge of his flagship watching the scanner displays with satisfaction. The species ahead called themselves humans, and their home system looked like easy prey. Intelligence reports showed a young civilization that had only discovered faster-than-light travel 30 years ago. Their military fleet was small and scattered across several colony worlds. Their technology seemed basic compared to Dominion standards. By all calculations, this would be conquest number 48, and it would take less than a week. Vector had assembled 300 warships for this operation. Each vessel carried enough firepower to level a continent. The humans had perhaps 60 ships defending their entire system. He transmitted the standard ultimatum on every frequency the humans used. The message was clear and direct. Surrender immediately or face total destruction. The Dominion gave them 12 hours to respond. Vector expected either instant capitulation or desperate pleas for mercy. Most species chose surrender once they saw the size of his fleet. The few who chose to fight never lasted more than a few days. The human response arrived within an hour. A woman appeared on the main view screen. She wore a dark blue uniform with silver insignia on the shoulders. Her hair was gray and cut short. Her eyes were steady and calm. She introduced herself as Admiral Kate Morrison of Earth Fleet Command. Vector studied her face, looking for signs of fear or panic. He saw neither. Morrison spoke in a measured tone without any hint of emotion. She acknowledged receipt of the Dominion ultimatum. She stated that humanity had reviewed the terms. Then she said something that made Vector pause. She told him that before he proceeded with his invasion, he needed to understand something important. Humanity did not want war, but humanity was absolutely prepared for it. She strongly advised him to withdraw his fleet and open diplomatic channels instead. Vector felt confused by her response. It was not a surrender. It was not even a threat. It sounded more like friendly advice from someone who knew something he did not. His translator worked to capture the nuances of her words. She seemed genuinely concerned for his safety. That made no sense at all. His fleet outnumbered hers 5-1. His weapons were centuries more advanced than anything humans had shown in their public displays. He responded with barely concealed irritation. He informed the Admiral that she did not seem to understand her situation. The Dominion fleet possessed overwhelming superiority in numbers and technology. Surrender was her only logical option. He repeated the 12-hour deadline. The Admiral shook her head slowly, like a teacher dealing with a stubborn student who refused to listen. Morrison leaned forward in her chair. She explained that the commander had reviewed human technological capability, based only on what humans had allowed him to see. He had observed their civilian spacecraft and their colonial defense systems. He had analyzed their public infrastructure and basic military vessels. But he had failed to ask himself one critical question. Why had a species that achieved faster-than-light capability 30 years ago remained so quiet in the galactic community? Vector dismissed this as psychological manipulation. Weaker species often tried to bluff when faced with superior force. He told Morrison that her questions were irrelevant. She had 12 hours to transmit unconditional surrender, or his fleet would advance. The Admiral sighed like someone who had tried their best to prevent an unfortunate outcome. She told him she would be direct since subtle warnings were not working. Morrison explained that humanity had not joined the galactic community actively because they were waiting and watching and learning. She mentioned an old human saying about speaking softly while carrying a big stick. She said that for 3 decades humanity had been very quiet indeed. Then she asked him not to make humanity show him why. The transmission ended before Vector could respond. His tactical officer reported that the message was clearly an attempt at psychological warfare. Weak species often tried to create doubt when they had no real options. The officer recommended proceeding with the invasion as planned. Vector agreed. He ordered all ships to advance into the Sol system at combat speed. The fleet moved forward in tight formation following standard Dominion doctrine. They passed Neptune without incident. They crossed Uranus orbit and still detected no opposition. The human fleet remained clustered near Earth, apparently content to let the invaders approach. Vector found this behavior strange, but assumed they were paralyzed by fear. Saturn came into view with its massive rings glittering in the distant sunlight. Still, the humans did nothing. Captain Lisa Martinez commanded the human destroyer Defiance, positioned in the outer defensive perimeter. She watched the enemy fleet advancing on her tactical display. Her crew sat at their stations waiting for orders. Martinez opened a channel to all sections of her ship. She told them the admiral had given the Jaltor commander a fair warning. He had chosen to ignore it. Now humanity would show him what they had been building while the galaxy thought humans were primitive. She gave a single command: activate Ghost Protocol. Throughout the Sol system, thousands of objects that had been catalogued as asteroids or dead satellites or simple space debris suddenly blazed with power signatures. Camouflage fields dropped away, revealing their true nature. Hidden weapon platforms came online. Defense stations built into hollowed moons activated their targeting systems. From the dark spaces between planets where they had drifted in complete silence, emerged the real human fleet. Vectar watched his tactical display in absolute shock as the contact numbers exploded. 100 human vessels appeared, then 200, then 500, then 1,000. His sensor officer stammered out a report in a shaking voice. These were not civilian ships. These were military warships, and their power signatures exceeded anything in Dominion databases. Many of these designs had never appeared in any intelligence report. The commander felt ice forming in his chest. He asked how this was possible. His intelligence officer worked frantically trying to understand. The data made no sense. These vessels had not been there during reconnaissance missions. They simply had not existed in any scans. Then the analysis came back. Many of these ships had been drifting in the system for years, powered down to minimal levels. They had been disguised as space debris and derelict satellites. Others had hidden behind gas giants or inside hollowed moons. The humans had turned their entire star system into a trap. Admiral Morrison reappeared on the view screen. Her expression showed sadness mixed with determination. She told Vectar that humanity had warned him. She explained that humans had spent 30 years preparing for this exact moment. They had studied every species in the region. They had learned from every conflict they observed. They had built a military force specifically designed to ensure that when war came to Earth, humanity would never be the weaker side. The tactical display updated, showing the true situation. 300 Jaltor warships were now completely surrounded by human forces that outnumbered them 3-1. Every weapon system was locked and ready to fire. Morrison gave Vectar one final chance. He could order his fleet to stand down and withdraw peacefully. Humanity did not want to kill anyone, but they absolutely would if he forced their hand. The choice was his to make. For the first time in his long military career, Commander Vectar understood what it felt like to be outmatched and trapped with no good options available. Commander Vectar stood motionless on the bridge of his flagship, staring at the tactical display that showed his complete encirclement. His officers waited in tense silence as their confidence drained away like water through broken glass. The proud Jaltor fleet that had crushed 47 civilizations now found itself trapped and outnumbered in a system they had assumed would be an easy conquest. Senior Analyst Kortha worked desperately at his station, trying to make sense of the sensor data. His hands moved rapidly across the controls, pulling up report after report. He finally spoke with obvious confusion in his voice. Every scan from their reconnaissance missions matched what they had reported. The human vessels simply had not been visible during those surveys. These 1,000 warships had somehow remained hidden, despite multiple detailed scans of the entire system. Vectar demanded an explanation for how 1,000 military vessels could appear from nothing. Kortha explained what his analysis revealed. Many of these ships had been drifting in space for years in a powered-down state, with only minimal life support active. They had been camouflaged to look like asteroids and old satellites and common space debris. Other vessels had hidden in the shadow of gas giants or been concealed inside moons that humans had hollowed out for that exact purpose. The humans had transformed their entire home system into an elaborate trap over the course of 3 decades. Tactical Officer Rentok pulled up weapon analysis on his screen. He reported with growing alarm that the signatures coming from human vessels matched nothing in Dominion databases. These were not modified versions of known technology. These were completely original designs that suggested an entirely different approach to warfare. The power readings from some vessels exceeded the output of their entire invasion fleet combined. On the view screen, Admiral Morrison waited patiently for a response. Behind her, the operations center of Earth Fleet Command showed dozens of officers working at their stations with calm efficiency. Vector could see no panic or uncertainty in their movements. They had clearly prepared for this moment and trained for it extensively. Morrison told him she understood he needed time to process the situation. However, her fleet commanders were growing nervous, and nervous people made mistakes. She needed his decision within 10 minutes. Vector muted the transmission and turned to face his senior staff. He asked for options in a voice that tried to hide his growing fear. War leader Thakron responded immediately. The scarred veteran who had personally led ground assaults on 17 worlds said they should fight. The Zhaltor did not retreat from species they considered inferior. Their honor demanded they engage the enemy regardless of the odds. Korta argued back with clear frustration. He pointed at the sensor displays and asked if honor mattered when facing weapons that could destroy their entire fleet. These humans had spent 30 years studying Dominion tactics. They knew exactly how the Zhaltor fought. They had built their defenses specifically to counter every standard Dominion strategy. This was not a battle they could win through courage or determination. Navigation Officer Silvera spoke quietly but firmly. She recommended immediate withdrawal. The Dominion had never lost a war in its long history, but it had also never fought a species that had prepared so thoroughly for their arrival. She argued that retreat now would at least allow them to return home and report what they had discovered. The Dominion Council needed to know that humanity represented a genuine threat unlike anything they had encountered before. Thakron responded angrily that withdrawal meant execution for cowardice. The Council showed no mercy to commanders who fled without fighting. Korta shot back that fighting and dying accomplished nothing except wasting 300 ships and thousands of trained crew. At least withdrawal gave them a chance to warn the Dominion about what humanity had become. Dead warriors could not deliver warnings. Vector studied the tactical display again, running combat simulations in his mind. Every scenario ended the same way: catastrophic losses or total annihilation. The human formation was flawless. Their positioning showed expert understanding of Dominion combat doctrine. They had created a perfect kill zone, and his fleet had sailed directly into the center of it. He thought of his daughter Keltar back on the homeworld. She had just passed her naming ceremony. She would never understand if he died here purely for the sake of pride. He unmuted the transmission and asked Admiral Morrison for clarification. If his fleet withdrew peacefully, would human forces pursue them beyond the system boundary? Morrison shook her head and stated clearly that humanity had no interest in conquest or revenge. They simply wanted to be left alone. If the Zhaltor fleet withdrew beyond the outer edge of the system, humans would consider the matter resolved. Vector asked what would happen if he refused her terms. The Admiral's expression turned hard as stone. She told him directly that human forces would destroy his fleet completely, not because they wanted bloodshed, but because he would leave them no alternative. She explained that she had studied Zhaltor history extensively. The Dominion never negotiated with species it perceived as weak. Therefore, she needed to make humanity's position absolutely clear. Humans were not weak. They were not unprepared. They were not bluffing about anything. Morrison continued speaking in a tone that mixed firmness with something almost like sympathy. She told Vector he had come to Sol's system expecting an easy victory over primitives. He had assumed humanity would surrender or die quickly like all the others, but humans had been preparing for this exact confrontation. Since their first deep space probes detected Dominion expansion patterns, every vessel in the system had been designed with one single purpose: to ensure Earth would never fall to invaders. Captain Lisa Martinez broke into the communication channel. She identified herself as commander of the destroyer Defiance. She told Vector she wanted to provide a demonstration to clarify the Admiral's statements. She emphasized this would cause no harm to his fleet. It was purely informational. One of the human destroyers broke from formation on the tactical display. The vessel was smaller than most Zhaltor warships, with unusual angular lines and weapon ports covering almost every surface. Martinez announced she was targeting a large asteroid, designated KB447, at a distance of 40,000 kilometers. She told Vector to observe carefully. The human destroyer fired a single weapon. The beam that emerged did not glow or pulse like normal energy weapons. Instead, space itself seemed to twist and distort along the path of the beam. Reality rippled in a way that made no scientific sense. The asteroid, measuring 3 kilometers across, vanished instantly. There was no explosion. There was no debris field. The massive chunk of rock and ice simply ceased to exist as if it had been erased from reality itself. Korta made a choking sound at his station. He reported in a shaking voice that the weapon had unmade matter at the quantum level. This was not just advanced technology. This represented physics that Dominion science did not understand at all. Martinez explained calmly that the quantum disruption cannon had fired at only 10% power. She added that at full power the same weapon could theoretically do the same thing to a planet given sufficient time. She mentioned casually that 200 similar weapons were distributed across the human fleet. War leader Thakron had gone completely silent, staring at the empty space where an asteroid had existed moments before. Admiral Morrison reappeared on screen. She told Vectar she was not trying to humiliate him or his crew. Her goal was to save lives on both sides. She knew the Dominion would send more fleets if this one did not return. She also knew Vectar would report everything he had witnessed here. She wanted this encounter to be a lesson learned rather than a tragedy that would be mourned by families on both sides. Morrison stood up from her chair. Her expression softened slightly as she explained humanity's perspective. 30 years ago, humans had sent their first faster-than-light probes into deep space. They discovered a galaxy full of other intelligent species. They observed civilizations like the Jaltor Dominion, conquering and expanding relentlessly. They studied the Dominion's path and realized it would eventually reach Earth. Humanity had faced a choice at that moment. They could try hiding, which would only delay the inevitable. They could attempt diplomacy, which Dominion history suggested would be pointless. Or they could prepare themselves for the day when someone like Vectar arrived. Every scientist and engineer and political leader on Earth had focused on answering one critical question. How does a species survive first contact with a hostile force that appears superior? The answer was to ensure they were not actually inferior when that day came. Morrison walked closer to the camera. She told Vectar he had come expecting conquest, but instead found a carefully prepared defense. However, it did not need to become a deadly trap. He could withdraw. He could survive. He could return home to whatever family waited for him. All he had to do was recognize when he had been outmaneuvered and make the intelligent choice. She gave him 5 minutes to decide. Choose life or choose death. The choice was entirely his to make. Commander Vectar closed his eyes and thought about his daughter Keltar, waiting for him back on the Dominion homeworld. She was only 8 cycles old and had just received her adult name in the traditional ceremony. If he died here in this distant system, she would grow up without a father. She would be told he died with honor, but she would never truly understand why he threw away his life for nothing more than pride. He opened his eyes and looked at war leader Thakron, who still wanted to fight despite the impossible odds. He looked at Korta, who had analyzed the data and understood they could not win. He looked at the tactical display showing 300 Dominion ships surrounded by 1,000 human vessels. Then he made his decision. Vectar ordered all ships to execute retreat pattern Delta 7. The fleet would withdraw immediately to the rally point beyond the system's outer boundary. Thakron's facial crest flared in shock and anger. He started to protest, but Vectar cut him off with a sharp command. The commander stated he would not sacrifice 300 crews on a battle they had no chance of winning. He told Thakron that everyone had seen the demonstration of the quantum weapon. That weapon had erased matter from existence. What did the war leader think it would do to their shields or their hull plating or their bodies? Vectar opened a channel to Admiral Morrison. He informed her that the Jaltor fleet accepted her terms and would withdraw from the system. He assumed human forces would monitor their departure to ensure compliance. Morrison nodded with what looked like genuine relief. She told him he had made the right choice and wished his fleet safe travels. The transmission ended on that surprisingly civil note. The Jaltor fleet turned in coordinated formation and began accelerating back toward the outer system. The human vessels maintained their positions with weapons still locked but not firing. They allowed the invaders to leave exactly as promised. Captain Lisa Martinez watched the retreat from her bridge. Her executive officer, Lieutenant Gary Cooper, asked if they should celebrate their victory. Martinez shook her head firmly. She told him there was nothing to celebrate. They had just made an enemy of an entire interstellar empire. The Dominion would not forget what happened here. Next time they returned, they would bring more ships and better intelligence, and they would be expecting human tricks. Cooper protested that they had won the encounter. Martinez corrected him patiently. They had won a single battle. The war had not even started yet. She understood that the Dominion would view this defeat as an insult that demanded revenge. Human preparations had bought them time but not permanent safety. 3 months passed before the Jaltor Dominion Council convened on their capital world. Commander Vektar stood in the center of the Judgment Circle waiting to learn his fate. 12 counselors sat in elevated seats around him. High Counselor Drakvon was the eldest among them. His scales had faded to pale gray with age, but his eyes remained sharp and alert. He reviewed the tactical data from the Sol system encounter with methodical care. Drakvon finally spoke in a voice like stones grinding together. He addressed Vektar directly and noted that the commander had withdrawn from battle without firing a single shot. He demanded an explanation for this unprecedented action. Vektar stood straight and met the High Counselor's gaze without flinching. He explained that he withdrew because his fleet was outnumbered 3-1 by an enemy with superior weapons and perfect tactical positioning. Engaging in combat would have resulted in the complete destruction of his fleet with zero strategic benefit. One of the counselors hissed the word coward. Vektar responded that he preferred the word pragmatic. He had brought back 300 ships and thousands of trained crew members. More importantly, he had brought back detailed intelligence about a species that posed a genuine threat to Dominion expansion. He had brought proof that they had finally encountered a civilization that could effectively resist their standard conquest methods. Drakvon raised one clawed hand to silence the murmuring counselors. He told Vektar to present this proof to the full council. Vektar activated the holographic display system. The recording from his flagship's sensors played for all to see. The counselors watched in growing disbelief as the hidden human fleet revealed itself. Thousands of contacts appeared where intelligence reports had predicted only dozens. When the playback reached the quantum disruption weapon demonstration, several counselors physically recoiled from the image. Drakvon asked if this weapon was real and not some kind of technological deception. Vektar confirmed it was absolutely real. He explained it was only one of many advanced weapons the humans possessed. Humanity had spent 30 years preparing specifically for contact with the Dominion. They had studied Jaltor tactics and technology. They had analyzed combat recordings from previous conquests. Then they built a military force designed specifically to counter Dominion advantages. Counselor Vormak, who served as chief military strategist, leaned forward with obvious interest. He asked how this was possible. Intelligence reports had clearly indicated humans were a primitive species, barely capable of faster-than-light travel. Vektar explained that assessment was exactly what humans wanted the Dominion to believe. Their civilian technology and public infrastructure had been deliberately maintained at lower levels. Meanwhile, their military research proceeded in complete secrecy. They practiced information security better than any species the Dominion had previously encountered. Korta, who had accompanied Vektar to the council session, added his analysis. He told the counselors that humanity was a paradoxical species. Individual humans were physically fragile with short lifespans and strong emotions. However, as a collective, they displayed remarkable coordination and innovative thinking. They had turned their late arrival to the galactic community into a strategic advantage. They watched and learned from other species before revealing their true capabilities. Drakvon sat in silence for a long moment, studying the data with ancient eyes. Finally, he spoke again. He told the council that the question before them was not whether Vektar had acted correctly. The evidence suggested his retreat was the only sensible choice. The real question was what the Dominion should do about humanity going forward. War Counselor Thrakmo stood up from his seat with aggressive energy. He declared they should crush the humans by sending 10 fleets instead of 1. Overwhelming numbers would break through any defense eventually. Vormak countered immediately, asking about the cost of such an operation. Even if they succeeded in conquering one human system, they would lose thousands of ships and tens of thousands of crew. The Dominion's strength had always come from efficient conquest. Humanity had deliberately made themselves extremely expensive to defeat. Another counselor asked if they were seriously considering leaving humanity alone. Did they intend to acknowledge that a single species had successfully defied the mighty Dominion? Drakvon raised his hand again, commanding silence. He said there was another option that the Dominion had not employed in 3 generations. He paused to let the weight of his words sink in. Then he spoke a single word that shocked every counselor present: diplomacy. The chamber erupted in surprised exclamations and angry protests. Thrakmos began to object that the Dominion did not negotiate with inferior species. Drakvon interrupted him with a voice that cut through the noise like a blade. He reminded everyone that the Dominion's primary purpose was survival. They expanded to survive. They conquered to survive. When necessary, they adapted to survive. The High Counselor stood slowly from his seat. His aged body still commanded absolute respect. He told the Council that humanity had shown them something they needed to see. The Dominion had grown complacent over centuries of easy victories. They had begun assuming all species would fall before them as simply as the first 47 conquests. But the galaxy was vast, and they had always known they would eventually encounter a civilization capable of effective resistance. Vector added that the humans had offered withdrawal rather than demanding surrender or tribute. They demonstrated overwhelming force but deliberately chose not to use it. They gave the Dominion a choice instead of forcing a fight to the death. War leader Thakron argued this was obviously because humans knew that destroying the fleet would guarantee total war. If they had killed everyone, the Dominion would have no choice except full retaliation. Wormak nodded thoughtfully at this observation. He said the humans were clearly not naive about politics. They understood that letting the fleet leave kept options open for future dialogue. By showing mercy, they had demonstrated strength while avoiding the cycle of inevitable revenge. It was actually a sophisticated strategy. Drakvon agreed with this assessment. He said humans were offering something unprecedented, the opportunity to treat them as equals rather than subjects. The Council had to decide whether to accept this offer or commit to a war that would cost resources on a scale not seen in generations. 6 weeks later, a single Zhaltor vessel approached the Sol system boundary. This ship looked nothing like the warships that had come before. It was a diplomatic courier with sleek lines and no visible weapons. The vessel broadcast peace signals on every frequency as it moved slowly toward the human defense perimeter. Captain Lisa Martinez watched its approach from the bridge of her destroyer Defiance. She had been assigned to outer patrol duty specifically because of her experience with the previous Zhaltor encounter. Lieutenant Gary Cooper ran continuous scans of the approaching vessel. He confirmed it carried no weapons and no hidden fleet waited nearby. The ship held only a small crew and extensive communication equipment. Admiral Morrison transmitted orders to all defensive positions. She instructed every ship to maintain formation, but not to activate targeting locks. She did not want to appear threatening before the Zhaltor even delivered their message. The diplomatic courier stopped at coordinates well beyond Neptune's orbit, exactly where human controllers had specified. A transmission request came through immediately. Morrison accepted the call from her command center on Earth. The face that appeared on screen belonged to Commander Vector, but he looked different. From their last meeting, he no longer wore the military uniform covered in rank insignia and battle honors. Instead, he wore simple robes in traditional Zhaltor diplomatic style. The outfit was so rarely used that most species did not even know it existed. Vector introduced himself as Ambassador Vector, representing the Zhaltor Dominion High Council. He stated formally that the Council had authorized him to propose diplomatic relations between their two civilizations. Morrison raised one eyebrow in obvious surprise. She noted this was quite different from the previous demand for immediate surrender. She asked what had caused such a dramatic change in Dominion. Policy, Vector replied with a single word: honesty. He explained that humanity had demonstrated they could not be easily conquered, if they could be conquered at all. The High Council had calculated that attempting invasion would cost more than any potential benefit. Additionally, High Counselor Drakvon had argued persuasively that perhaps the Dominion should learn to coexist with equals, rather than only ruling subjects. Morrison repeated the word, equals, slowly, as if testing how it sounded. She observed this represented a significant philosophical shift for an empire built entirely on conquest. Vector acknowledged the difficulty of this transition. He admitted his people did not find change comfortable. However, the Zhaltor were above all else practical. Humanity had offered his fleet the chance to withdraw with dignity, instead of forcing them into a corner where pride demanded a fight to the death. That pragmatism deserved an equally pragmatic response. Morrison asked what specific proposal the ambassador was bringing. Vector outlined the basics of a mutual non-aggression treaty. The Dominion would recognize all human territories, including the Sol system, and colonial worlds as sovereign and independent. In exchange, humanity would agree not to interfere with Dominion operations in other sectors of space. Morrison considered this carefully. She acknowledged it was a reasonable starting point. However, she pointed out the proposal essentially asked humanity to ignore continued dominion conquest of other species. Vectar looked uncomfortable. He explained that broader dominion policy was beyond his authority to negotiate. He could only address the relationship between humans and Jaltor specifically. The Admiral stood and walked closer to the camera. She told Vectar she needed to be absolutely clear about something. Humanity had not built their defensive fleet solely to protect themselves. They built it because they believed in a different vision for how civilization should interact. Humans would not actively interfere in dominion conquests. However, they also would not pretend to approve of such actions. Morrison explained what Earth could offer: a non-aggression pact between their species, open trade relationships, cultural exchange programs, but also something else. If any species encountered by the Dominion asked humanity for assistance, humans would listen to that request. If they decided help was justified, they would provide it without hesitation. Vectar warned this policy could easily lead to armed conflict between their civilizations. Morrison agreed that possibility existed. However, she suggested it might also encourage the Dominion to reconsider their approach to expansion. She reminded the ambassador that his people claimed to be practical. The practical reality was that humanity had now become a major military power in this region of space. The Dominion could have humans as neutral trading partners, or they could have humans as active opposition. The choice belonged to them. Vectar sat quietly for a moment. Then a strange expression crossed his alien features that might have been amusement. He told Morrison he was beginning to understand why High Counselor Drakvon had sent him instead of War Counselor Thrakmos for this mission. The Admiral was negotiating from obvious strength while simultaneously offering cooperation. He found the approach interesting. Morrison explained it was called enlightened self-interest. Humanity would protect their own interests first. However, they also understood that a galaxy full of enslaved populations was not stable long-term. Eventually, conquered species either rebelled or stagnated under oppression. Then everyone suffered from the resulting chaos. Vectar asked if the Admiral truly believed the Dominion Empire was unsustainable in its current form. Morrison stated she believed any empire built purely on military force was inherently unstable. Eventually, the Dominion would run out of species weak enough to conquer easily. At that point, they would have built no foundation of goodwill or genuine alliances. They would have nothing except fear, and fear only lasted until something more frightening appeared. The ambassador observed that Morrison was essentially suggesting the Dominion needed to change its fundamental nature. Morrison chose her words carefully. She said she was suggesting the Dominion could evolve. She pointed out that humanity's own history included thousands of years of conquest and empire building. Humans had enslaved each other and nearly destroyed their own civilization multiple times. What finally saved them was learning that cooperation produced better long-term results than domination. Vectar noted that despite this peaceful philosophy, humanity had still built extremely powerful weapons. Morrison smiled slightly. She explained that humans had learned two lessons from their violent history. The first was that cooperation worked better than force. The second was that peace required strength. Humans cooperated because they chose to not, because anyone forced them. Anyone who tried to force humanity discovered they had made a serious mistake. The Dominion had learned this lesson already. Vectar made a gesture his translator interpreted as thoughtful agreement. He told Morrison he would return to the High Council with her counterproposal: a non-aggression pact with trade and cultural exchange, with the understanding that humanity reserved the right to assist other species who requested help. He predicted the Council would not be pleased with that final condition. Morrison suggested perhaps the Council should consider whether making more enemies was wise policy. It might prove more profitable and certainly safer to start making friends instead. After the transmission ended, Morrison turned to her senior staff. General Paul Henderson, who commanded Earth Defense Forces, spoke first. He said the negotiations had gone better than expected. He asked if she thought the Dominion would actually agree to those terms. Morrison predicted they would accept most of the proposal. The provision about helping other species would create arguments. Ultimately, though, she believed the Jaltor would agree. They were practical, as Vectar kept emphasizing. They would calculate that a limited treaty with some restrictions was vastly preferable to prolonged war with humanity. Commander Helen Brooks, who served as Morrison's strategic advisor, asked what would happen if the Dominion rejected the terms entirely. Morrison replied that humanity would continue building their forces and continue preparing. More importantly, they would continue reaching out to species the Dominion had conquered. Several of those civilizations had expressed strong interest in alternatives to Dominion rule. General Henderson realized what Morrison was doing. She was not just negotiating, she was building a potential alliance against the Dominion. Morrison corrected him gently. She was building options for humanity. If the Dominion chose diplomacy, then everyone could prosper together. If they chose continued aggression, they would find themselves facing opposition from multiple species, not just humans. Either way, the galaxy was changing. The age of easy conquest had ended. 3 months after that conversation, Ambassador Vector returned to Sol System. This time he carried the official response from the High Council. The treaty document was not perfect. It included restrictions on human expansion that Morrison disliked. It did not force the Dominion to stop conquering other species entirely. But it represented real progress and established formal diplomatic relations. The signing ceremony took place on a new space station humanity had constructed specifically for diplomatic meetings. Admiral Morrison represented Earth and all human colonies. Ambassador Vector represented the Zhaltor Dominion. In a move that surprised many observers, 3 other species sent representatives to witness the signing. The KR. 2 years passed after the treaty signing, and humanity had become something unexpected in the galaxy. Not conquerors, but catalysts for change. The Sol System buzzed with constant activity, as species from across multiple sectors sent trade missions and diplomatic delegations. Some came seeking knowledge. Others came seeking refuge from oppression. All of them came because they had heard what happened when the Dominion tried to invade Earth. The diplomatic station humanity built in orbit around the moon had been named Unity. Captain Lisa Martinez had been promoted to Commodore and given command of the defense fleet protecting the station. She watched dozens of ships arrive and depart every day, carrying representatives from 23 different species. The station had become the most diverse meeting place in known space. Commander Gary Cooper served as her executive officer, having followed her to this new assignment. He briefed her each morning on the day's scheduled activities. 3 delegations were arriving today. The Saran wanted to discuss technology exchange agreements. The Krelvax were negotiating a mutual defense pact. A new species called the Varathi had sent observers to learn how multi-species diplomacy actually worked in practice. Martinez noted that the Varathi had been on the Dominion's conquest list. Cooper confirmed they were directly in the path of Dominion expansion. Apparently, they had heard about Earth's successful defense and decided talking to humans was preferable to waiting for Zhaltor warships. Martinez scheduled meetings with all 3 groups but reminded Cooper to keep security alert. The Saran and Krelvax had difficult history between them. Cooper asked what kind of history. Martinez explained the Dominion had conquered both species several years apart. Then the Dominion had deliberately created territorial disputes, forcing them to fight each other. Both species had technically been at peace since the Dominion stopped manipulating them. However, generations of conflict had created deep wounds that did not heal quickly. Down on Earth, Admiral Morrison walked through the expanded command center that now served dual purposes. It remained headquarters for Earth Defense Forces. It had also become the coordination center for what people informally called the Free Species Alliance. Diplomats were still arguing about an official name. Meanwhile, the informal title had spread across multiple star systems. Colonel Jeff Martinez greeted the Admiral in one of the technical sections. He was Lisa's younger brother, recently transferred from Mars Command. He reported that engineering teams had finished upgrading the Defiance and her sister ships. All vessels now carried the newest generation of quantum disruption weapons. These new models were more efficient and more precise than the original prototypes. Morrison asked if these were the weapons that did not erase matter quite so dramatically. Jeff confirmed with a slight smile. The new generation scaled better and could be manufactured quickly enough to equip Allied vessels. Both the Soran and Krelvax governments had formally requested the weapon blueprints. Morrison frowned and asked if the Oversight Council had approved sharing such advanced technology. Jeff explained the approval came with significant restrictions and monitoring requirements. The reasoning was that true allies needed the ability to defend themselves effectively. Otherwise, humanity would just be creating dependent client states instead of genuine partners. That would make Earth no better than the Dominion despite using different methods. Morrison agreed with this logic. She authorized the technology transfer, but emphasized the importance of thorough oversight. She did not want these weapons ending up in the wrong hands or being used for conquest instead of defense. The real test of humanity's new role came 6 months later without warning. The Rathan species, who were peaceful aquatic beings, found themselves suddenly invaded by Dominion forces. The Rathan had heard about Earth's treaty with the Zoltor. They sent an urgent plea for help directly to Admiral Morrison. An emergency session convened at Station Unity within hours. Representatives from 12 species crowded into the council chamber. Everyone wanted to see how humanity would respond to this crisis. Ambassador Vector attended via secure transmission from his diplomatic quarters. A holographic projection showed Prime Speaker Keleth of the Rathan people. Her translucent features were distorted by obvious stress and fear. Keleth reported that Dominion forces had already captured 3 outer colonies. Over 3 million Rathan citizens were now under military occupation. The invaders had delivered the standard Dominion ultimatum: submit to rule or face complete destruction. Keleth addressed Morrison directly with desperation in her voice. She reminded the Admiral of her previous statement. If a species asked humanity for help, humans would listen. She was asking now. She was begging for assistance. Morrison looked at Ambassador Vector with a hard expression. She asked what he could tell them about this invasion. Vector appeared genuinely troubled. He explained that War Counselor Thrakmos had authorized the operation under traditional Dominion expansion doctrine. The Rathan territory was not covered by the treaty between humans and Zoltor. That treaty only protected human holdings specifically. Morrison stated flatly that the Rathan were excluded because they were not human. Vector clarified that the treaty language specifically mentioned the Sol system and human colonial worlds. The High Council had not yet decided whether their diplomatic relationship with humanity should restrict Dominion operations in other regions. Commodore Martinez spoke from her position at the security station. She suggested the Dominion was testing humanity. They wanted to see if Earth actually meant what they said about helping other species, or if those statements were empty words. Vector admitted this assessment was crude but not entirely wrong. Factions within the Dominion still believed the treaty with humanity had been a mistake that showed weakness. Thrakmos belonged to that faction. This invasion was partly about territorial expansion. It was also about proving the Dominion had not grown soft. Morrison walked to the large viewport showing Earth rotating peacefully below. She stood silently for a long moment while every representative in the chamber watched and waited. Finally, she turned back to face them all. She told Prime Speaker Keleth that humanity would help the Rathan people. Earth would send a fleet to their homeworld. The Dominion would not be allowed to conquer them. Relief flooded across Keleth's features. She thanked Morrison repeatedly with obvious emotion. Vector's facial crest flared in alarm. He warned that if humanity intervened, it would violate the spirit of their treaty. The High Council would view military action as aggression. Morrison replied calmly that the High Council would need to make a choice then. She told Vector they both understood this was a deliberate test. Thrakmos wanted to force a confrontation because he never accepted the idea of the Dominion backing down. He was about to get his confrontation, but probably not the outcome he hoped for. She turned to address all the species representatives present. She announced that humanity was offering mutual defense to every species in the chamber. Earth would help them defend their territories. Humans would share technology and tactical training. They would stand with anyone against any aggressor, including the Dominion if necessary. A wave of surprised conversation swept through the room. Morrison raised her voice to continue. She emphasized this was an alliance of equals, not a protection arrangement. Humanity would not conquer territory for anyone. They would not build empires. They would not make decisions for other species. If anyone wanted human help, they had to be willing to stand independently and contribute to collective defense. The Soran representative named Torin stood up on his forearms. He announced the Soran Union accepted these terms completely. If humanity helped the Rathan, the Soran would send ships to join the fleet. The Krelvax representative Zilara rose next. She stated the Krelvax collective would also contribute vessels to the defense. One by one, representatives stood and pledged support. By the time Morrison finished counting, 11 species had committed to joining the defense of Rathan space. Vectar watched this happen with something approaching awe. He told Morrison she had just created an alliance capable of matching Dominion's strength fleet for fleet. Morrison agreed that was precisely the intention. She instructed Vectar to send a message to High Counselor Drakvon immediately. A combined fleet from 12 species was about to enter Rathan territory. This fleet would engage Dominion forces and drive them back. If the Dominion chose to escalate the conflict, they would face not just humanity but an alliance of species who had decided they were finished being conquered. Vectar asked, what would happen if Drakvon chose total war? Morrison's expression became hard as iron. She told him the galaxy would experience its first true interstellar war, and everyone would pay a terrible price. However, she did not believe Drakvon would choose that path. He was the leader who had sent Vectar to negotiate originally. He understood the galaxy had fundamentally changed. The question was whether the rest of the Dominion Council understood this reality yet. 3 weeks later, the combined Allied fleet arrived in Rathan space. 40 human warships flew alongside 15 Sorin vessels and 12 Krelvax ships. Smaller contingents from 9 other species completed the formation. Together, they formed a battle line facing the Dominion occupation force of 150.